Joseph Orozco, and I'm a professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion here in the Philosophy Department. I'm also the director of the Peace Studies program here at OSU, and one of the founders of the Inares Project for Alternative Futures. These are all three sponsors of today's program. So the Peace Studies program is a program that offers an undergraduate minor in the study of peace and conflict here at OSU. And we try to bring many, many different speakers to campus to talk about ways in which we can resolve conflict in a peaceful way and think about social transformation towards a more nonviolent world. The Inares Project for Alternative Futures is a new project that has been started by myself and my colleague in philosophy and sociology, Tony Vogt. We're inspired by the speculative fiction of Oregon writer Ursula K. Le Guin. We take our name from her novel, The Dispossessed. And the purpose and the mission of the project is to envision creating futures that are free from oppression, domination, exploitation, and war. And so today we're honored to be able to invite you to have a discussion with Katherine Ann Power. I'll let Katherine talk more about her story in particular and her life because it's central to the kinds of lessons that she wants to share with us today. But I want to say that in 2008, the Peace Studies program had the luck to be able to host Mark Rudd, one of the former leaders of the Weather Underground. And what was striking about his visit was he came to OSU and he talked about the deep regret that he had in engaging in the kinds of actions that the Weather Underground did in the 1970s in attempting to try to end the Vietnam War. His regret was that his dedication to armed struggle at that point essentially disintegrated a very vibrant anti-war movement and scuttled nonviolent attempts for social change in the United States. And he realized that he was directly responsible for that and felt that he had to work to try to gain trust and to try to reconnect forces that could try to bring about nonviolent social change in the United States, to create a United States which was more dedicated to equality, freedom, and so forth in the way that he originally had thought he was trying to do when he decided to commit himself to armed struggle. And so, in continuing in that tradition, we're very lucky today to have Katherine Ann Power come talk to us about her experiences in a similar trajectory to Mark Rudd. I first met Katherine when I first came to OSU 12 years or so ago. She was just leaving the program here, had finished her master's degree here at OSU. And at the time, I didn't know who Katherine was. I was invited to a party for her going away. And through high school, graduate school, undergraduate, I had been a student of nonviolent social movements. I knew the big names. And I knew of the incident in which Katherine was involved in that led to these enormous changes in her life. But when I met her, I didn't know that this was her in front of me. And so it was only after that she left that I realized, oh my God, that was Katherine. So Katherine has extensive connections to OSU, to the Corvallis community, and to Oregon. And so many of you perhaps may know her personally and are friends with her or know her here. Many of you may be coming to hear first time about her experiences. But I think that the tale that she's going to tell about the arc of her life that she has taken and the work that she has done towards thinking about restoration and moving away from a politics of rage is a very inspiring one for folks who are interested in nonviolent social change. So I'll let Katherine speak now, and I want to make sure that you, please, if you're interested in further finding out about events like this that are being offered by the Inares Project and the OSU Peace Studies program, please, there's a sign-up sheet at the table back there. Please make sure to give us your contact information before you leave so that we can inform you about future events. But with that, I want to make sure that we give Katherine a welcome to, and a return welcome to OSU.
I want to thank you all for being here and for your interest in practical peace and ways of engaging in social change that don't arise from rage and have the inevitable destructive consequences. I want to thank Oregon State for all that it's given me. I treasure what I learned and experienced here in my master's degree studies. And I want to thank Joseph and Tony for this invitation to address the campus. It's fun to be back. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about what I mean when I say from guerrilla to grandmother. And then I'd like to read two passages from my forthcoming memoir entitled Surrender. And then I'd love to open it up for questions and discussion, because I think that's really the liveliest part of all of this. So, guerrilla to grandmother. When I was 21, at the height of the popular frustration at the ongoing and obscenely violent Vietnam War, a number of activists integrated a lot of issues and really had the understanding that a deep transformation, which we called revolution, was really the only answer. These issues were going to continue to emerge and continue to emerge. And it wasn't as harebrained an idea as it sounds. After all, there was the Prague Spring, the uprising in Paris, and there were anti-colonial revolutions all over Africa and Latin America. So it wasn't that we were psychotic. We were just wrong. And I think my own motivation and that of many of us was rage. And I want to talk about rage for a minute and the politics of rage, because I think as Americans, we're used to having agency, power. We are used to being able to make things be a certain way. And we could not make the napalm stop. We could not end the free fire zone. We elected, the whole nation elected Richard Nixon on a promise to end the war, and he expanded the war. And that really kind of was the moment when, as Todd Gitlin says, like, that was it. You know, there was no, that there was such an explosion of frustration at that anti-democratic outcome that lots of people looked outside of the usual electoral politics for answers. So, but what I think about the politics of rage is really that rage arises from our unwillingness to sit with the suffering that we see, and with our own inability to make it stop. It's not an inability to do things about it, but it's an inability to make it stop. And to sit with that suffering is very painful. And I think it's some of the important work that we do. It's the alternative to the politics of rage. And when I talk about guerrilla to grandmother, that's a little bit about the Guerrilla Stage, where I joined. I was invited to join, and I joined a group of 5 people who were going to be a little revolutionary guerrilla cell. And I don't think that any of us knew what we were doing. And I think the moment that I stepped into clandestinity and secrecy, the possibility of anybody challenging our judgment was gone. And so I always consider that step into clandestinity and secrecy is a really dangerous step. We were engaged, as were a lot of Latin American revolutionaries, in robbing a bank to finance the revolution. I don't think any of us knew what that meant. But one of the people who kind of was the central organizer had been in prison for armed robbery, and that was kind of the skill set we were working with. He was on furlough from Walpole Prison on the Brandeis campus, and that's kind of how that nucleus arose. Well, in the process of this robbery to liberate funds, this romantic gun-toting violence, Officer Walter Schroeder was killed. And he left a family and a community behind. And I want to say that I believe that that is the inevitable endpoint of the politics of rage. And it has really moved me to understand how we can make social change really effectively without bullets and torn flesh, because I think that's an unacceptable outcome. In the same way that it is unacceptable that grandmothers and children are exploded by drones in Afghanistan, it's unacceptable that our movements for change result in bullet-riddled bodies. And yet we can't stop being activists. And so I use the word grandmother a little bit intentionally, not only because I have 2 grandsons, but because grandmother is a figure of wisdom who encompasses history and a long life of thought. And I'm committing myself through my work in practical peace to bring what I know and understand now to the conversation, and hope that it's joined by lots of other people in the conversation. So if you want to know more about practical peace, I have a website, practicalpeace.net, and there's more theory and practice there, if you will. But for today, I want to read 2 pieces from my memoir, Surrender, which is a work in progress, and I think that they'll illustrate a little bit of my own progression in these thoughts. And I'm going to start with the first chapter. It's a little bit light, and I think that's really important because I think everything else after that is very serious. So, surrender, the beginning. People with secrets they plan to keep don't go to therapists. Even though I hadn't left the house for weeks, could barely talk and hardly moved, I wouldn't have thought of going to a therapist. I had been on a year-long workaholic binge, consulting for a fast food company, putting in 50-hour weeks as a restaurant manager in a hotel, flying to Seattle with a business plan to take over that lease and start my own restaurant. I was calling friends at midnight for coffee and pulling an occasional shift at the restaurant that I already owned. All that busyness was the only way that I knew to get out of bed in the morning. It blocked out the screaming pain in my heart, the same as 2 glasses of wine did in the evening. Then, one by one, the projects wound down, and I was left mute on the couch. I saw an ad in the paper for a 4-week class on women in depression offered by the local hospital. I have to go to this, I said to Ron, my partner of 13 years, the words squeezing past my throat that was by that time almost always closed with tears. I didn't say, I am dying, but it was true. I called to sign up, not sure where the $45 fee would come from now that I wasn't bringing any money into the house. I expected it would be taught by a nurse, but the woman who told me, but the woman on the phone told me it would be led by a social worker. Nurse, social worker, it was all the same to me, I thought. Just someone who would stand up in front of the room and show me how to manage this mood disorder with exercise and better eating habits. I arrived a little early for the first evening session and was staring out the hospital window at the purpling sky, trying not to cry. Another woman arrived, then another. We didn't speak. I imagined they were depressed too, since we were all here for the same class. Then an energetic bustle as a blonde, curly-haired woman in brightly patterned, silky clothes finished a conversation over her shoulder with someone walking down the hallway out of sight, and came in to tell us that our group had been moved to a room across the hall. It felt safe that the room was set up classroom style, a dozen chairs facing a table at the front. I was prepared to take good notes, go home, and apply the advice. The energetic woman, six of us took our seats, and the energetic woman introduced herself as Linda Carroll. She said she was a family therapist with a particular interest in women's depression. She looked at us with clear blue eyes and with disconcerting directness asked each of us to say why we had come. All I wanted to do was get out of that room. How was I to know that a social worker could be a therapist? When it came to my turn, I said, tears welling, I am here because I can't talk without crying. I would give that level of participation, I thought, but no more. It was true, it was safe, and besides, it was obvious. I was staring off, counting down the time until I could leave, when she asked us, so where is your soul in all of this? My attention came back to the room, to her. I was startled, scared, and a little bit thrilled. Soul was the last word I expected to hear from someone who called herself a therapist. I have never thought that there might be a key that could unlock all that was tangled inside me. But she had just said it, and it was like Ali Baba saying, open sesame. My soul was so lonely. Against every instinct of fugitive survival, I wanted to trust her. I came back the next week and the next. That week, the subject was our family of origin. I had my usual story prepared, but was relieved when another woman in the group wanted to talk first. We spent time on her story, Linda skillfully eliciting insights into the dynamics of that early life and its effects in her life as an adult. At my turn, I said what I had been telling people for as long as I had been Alice Metzinger. I'm estranged from my family, I said, and made a vague reference to disagreements over the Vietnam War. Whenever I had said that to the friendly women I worked with at the community college, or to my next-door neighbor, or even to my own son, Jamie, I had managed to put something in my expression that kept anyone from asking for more. I expected it to work the same way this time. Linda declared simply, with that kind of innocent confidence that people have when they are speaking of natural laws, but you'll never get better if you don't resolve the issues with your family of origin. When the session ended, I walked out of the room with her, took the elevator to the first floor, and asked her to come with me into the waiting room, unused and unlit at this hour. We sat opposite each other in the dark. I need to tell you why I can't reconnect with my family. I'm on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. I've been a fugitive for my whole adult life. There, I had said it. Said it in that half-defiant way that kids use when they know their argument trumps their parents' arguments and will shut them up with shouts. I was part of a bank robbery and a police officer was killed. I was a student radical. It was the Vietnam War. When exactly was this, she asked. 1970. That was a long time ago. They can't possibly care very much about that. Probably no one is even looking for you now. Of course they're still looking for me. Someone was killed. A police officer was killed. Still, it's been more than 20 years. The country has changed. Lots of people were doing crazy things back then. We made our arguments back and forth in low voices in the dark, seeing each other only in the stray light from the hall. She had her innocent certainty, and I had my reflex of survival in a life of being hunted. After a few go-rounds, Linda made a suggestion. At least you need to talk to a lawyer to know what the real situation is. I'm going to give you the number of someone I think can help. Someone who, from other things I know about him, would probably be willing to work on something this irregular. She gave me Stephen Black's number. I took it. Everything was going along with a momentum of its own. I was going along, I guess, because I was just sick and tired of being so sad. 754-7774. Through all the 6 years in prison, every time I punched that number into the telephone in the day room, I would remember that first time, that hot and sunny day in late May, standing at a payphone so that the call would not be traced. Black, he answered. I want to make an appointment to see you, I choked out. It was almost impossible to push out breath and shape my mouth into these words. Okay, what is it in regard to? I would rather not say over the phone. Okay, what's your name? I would rather just talk to you about it in person. Okay, you can come at 2 o'clock. And he gave me directions to an address in Corvallis where he practiced law out of an office at the front of his house. I parked a block away, around the corner by the park, found the house in front of which a sign read, Stephen Black, Public Defense Services, and punched the doorbell. The figure who answered was tall, with a smile, a smirk, that suggested he might take everything as a joke, and a pipe in the corner of his mouth. "I'm the one who called," I said. He invited me into the hallway. There was a moment's awkwardness as he finished showing out a man who had been visiting. You can't really do introductions when one person has made it clear that she's not telling you her name. He showed me into the office. I sat in an armed wooden chair facing him and tried to talk. For over 20 years, survival had depended on never saying my own name or telling the truth about my own life. Of the two exceptions, one had turned out disastrously, and one was Ron, who I knew from soon after I met him was a person I would be able to share my whole self with. We owned a house and were raising a son and considered each other soulmates, and he had absolutely no idea of what I was about to do. I cleared my throat and began, "My name." I couldn't finish the sentence. I paused and tried again. "My name is Katherine Power, and I am a fugitive, and I want you to look into what would be my situation if I turned myself in." He said he needed a retainer of $1 to be officially my attorney, preserving the privilege of attorney-client confidentiality. I had a 20, he didn't have change. I had a nickel, and he threw in the other 95 cents from his pocket. As calmly as if we were talking about traffic violations, Stephen outlined a strategy for contacting the feds through an attorney in another state, avoiding direct contact so that the exploration would be what he called reversible. He could plan it, he said, so that if what he found out didn't result in my turning myself in, I could just go on living with a name he didn't know in a town he didn't know of, as if I had never made this step. He seemed, with his irreverence and crinkly eyes, gleeful at having such an interesting puzzle to solve. I saw what Linda meant about his willingness to deal with a less than regular situation. That evening, after Ron came home from work, we drove down to the boat landing to watch the river and talk about our day. We talked about the work at his meat-cutting job, what he had heard on the news. I talked about not much, but he was used to this. I hadn't had a lot to talk about since the workaholic life had come crashing down. Even though now that I was going to the depression group, I could think a little better and get out more, I still didn't have much going on in life. I didn't like the feeling of not saying much when there was plenty to say. I didn't like the feeling, but I didn't know what else to do. I had a lot of experience in keeping secrets, even though I hadn't kept many from him. We got in the car and headed back home. We got only as far as the end of the boat landing lane when I knew I had to tell him. I pulled into the Circle K parking lot and parked. We got out of the car. "I have something to tell you," I said. "I went to see a lawyer today. I asked him to explore what my situation would be if I turned myself in." He pounded on the roof of the car with the flat of his hand, his face twisted. "Why don't you just leave now? Just turn yourself in, because that's what you're doing." Tears welling now. "How could you do this without even talking with me? We're partners. We make decisions together. When people are sharing a life, one of them doesn't just go and make unilateral decisions." I hated it when he laid out rules like a dogmatist. I knew that this was exactly why I hadn't talked with him first. I never would have gone, and I had to go. "We're going to be careful," I protested. "We're going to make sure that anything we do is reversible." I believed that after this little exploration, maybe we could just choose to go on in this life of living in Lebanon and raising Jamie, fishing in the spring, gardening in the summer, hunting in the fall, and hunkering by the wood stove through the rainy winters. Maybe believing that was the only way to take this step. But he knew better. He saw with complete clarity that I had just changed everything forever. We got back into the car and didn't speak for the rest of the way home. I took a Kelly Temporaries job in the engineering department at the pulp mill and bought grooved cedar shingles to refinish the weathered west side of the house. Jamie was 13 that summer, and he and his friends took themselves to the boat landing to swim without me. Stephen wouldn't start the legal process unless Linda could assure him that I was mentally stable enough to go through it. She did an in-depth evaluation and said that we would have to meet once a week. I started talking about things that my life had depended on not talking about Catholic school and Brandeis, about my father's blistering rage and how I shielded my brothers and sisters by being his little star performer, about going crazy with grief over burning babies in Vietnam, about not being able to sort out the difference between my father and the government, the burned babies in Vietnam, and my blistered sibs. That doesn't sound like it was the light part. But there were a few laugh lines. And I think this next part is more thoughtful and really illustrates the transformation in myself that I achieved during the inner work that I did in prison. I have to say, I pretty much did it despite the Department of Corrections, whose culture is you're here for punishment, not for nourishment, and you are irredeemable. But balancing that was the chaplaincy, the education, the Boston University Prison Education Program, where in fact I got my bachelor's degree, and the friends who came to visit me, all of whom held me in their regard as someone who had the capability of being full and returning free to a community. So I was sentenced to 8 to 12 years. My attorney told me that meant 5. And I think that maybe all defense attorneys lie, because that's the only way anybody would say yes to anything. I got my admission papers at Framingham, and the earliest possible release date was more than 7 years out, and that included what they call statutory good time. But I earned all the good time that I could, and my parole eligibility date, which was 5 years from my surrender, came to be. So this is the story of what happened in the parole hearing room. Deep surrender. Around 4 o'clock, 2 officers came in and uncuffed me from the chair. "It's time," they said. They walked me down the hall into the hearing room. The 5 members of the parole board sat at a table in front of the room. A smaller table for whoever was speaking faced them. The rest of the room was filled with 30 or so chairs where many members of Walter Schroeder's family and community opposing my release were seated. The officers led me to the table at the front of the room. My hands remained uncuffed, but the shackles still sat on my ankles. Miss Power, a member of the parole board, began. "We understand that your behavior while incarcerated has been exemplary, that you have been a fine and upstanding citizen at Framingham. If everyone there behaved as you have, it would be a lovely place to be." But that is not what we are here to consider today. Instead, we will be deciding whether the interests of justice are served by your release from prison to the community on parole at this time. For 2 hours, I answered questions about everything I had done, what I thought about it now, what I thought about it then, what I thought about it now. Finally, "Why do you think we should grant you parole, Miss Power? Do you think you have served a long enough sentence for the murder of Walter Schroeder?" "I don't want parole for myself," I said. "I could serve the rest of my sentence, but my son needs me. This is a difficult time in his life. I need to be there for him." "Do you realize the profound irony of what you are saying, Miss Power?" he answered. After all, Walter Schroeder's children had needed him too, but he hadn't been there for them because he had been murdered by a gang of gun-toting bank robbers. I could not argue that I had not fired a gun at anyone, that I had not even been on the scene. This was a time to ignore the fine points about limited legal responsibility and claim fully my human responsibility. After this questioning, I was moved to a seat at the side of the room. It was time for the people who opposed my release on parole to testify. Marie Schroeder, Officer Schroeder's widow, talked about how she fears when her children who are police officers go out to work every day. how she cannot talk to her grandchildren about this fear that their father or mother will never come home again. His brother testified that the 4.5 years I had spent in prison were simply not enough to pay for my crime, for the murder of his brother. Two of the older Schroeder sons testified about how their lives had been changed, about how hard their lives were after the murder of their father. One said that he too had opposed the Vietnam War, but he had been too busy with his college studies to protest. They could have been my friends and colleagues in Oregon, these men. They requested that the members of the board deny my application for parole and require that I serve my whole sentence in prison. Through all this, I sat on the sidelines with tears streaming, listening, opening my heart, watching for some moment when I could discern what to do or say that would address their sorrow and loss, that would express my contrition. Then it was Claire Schroeder's turn to speak. She addressed my statement and all my answers in the hearing. She spoke scathingly about our gun-toting romanticism that had left her father dead. She told the story of the killing of one of her brothers, how the person who killed him was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to a few years in prison. They did not feel that it was enough, but that is what the law said, and they were people who honored the law. Then she talked about my own surrender and plea agreement. I was to be sentenced to serve 8 to 12 years. Again, they did not feel that this was enough, but it was all that the law could offer them. They accepted it. And now she doesn't even want to keep that agreement, Claire said. Right then, I thought of every peace process I had ever learned about, how the two sides each held their own narrative of the history, how peace broke through when one side could really see the other side's narrative as legitimate, at least equally with their own. To my loved ones, the agreement was that I would return home in 5 years. That the release would be a parole was a meaningless distinction. I had done my time, done my inner work. To Walter Schroeder's people, that sentence meant serving the entire time behind bars in a medium security prison, away from ordinary life and family. Finally, Claire noted the eloquence of my acceptance of responsibility for my crimes in the statement I had written, and found it wanting in sincerity. Where was this remorse when I surrendered, and in every statement I had made since then? She said that anyone with half a brain would know that they had to take responsibility and express remorse in order to be paroled. In that moment, I knew what to do. I was returned to the table before the board to make my final remarks. It is clear, I said to them, that what I came here to do today, which is to express my unconditional remorse for my actions in the murder of Walter Schroeder, cannot be accomplished as long as it is attached to a request to be released on parole. Therefore, I withdraw my request. There followed a stunned silence and the shuffling of papers. The head of the board took up her pen and said, "Let's make sure I have this right. You are withdrawing your request for parole?" She read back what I had said, and I affirmed it. For a few minutes, the board made notes, and then I was escorted into the next room and manacled again. Officers escorted me through the hallways and down the stairs out into the night that had fallen by now. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions. I ignored them. I thought that what I had done would probably become another big news story, but I did not care. All that was in another universe of fighting and enemies, not the world of the open heart that I'd somehow found my way into in those last moments.